So good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm so delighted, in fact, to open this fourth session of the seminar series that we are conducting on land, housing, and property rights, tracing policy shifts and emerging issues in India and the Global South. This is focused on a three-way urban labs conversation on spatial practices and critical mapping. And I've got a wonderful cast here who will be speaking today in this conversation. Let me begin by saying I'm Lalita Kamath. I'm a faculty here at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. And on behalf of my center, want to welcome all of you, particularly the speakers for today. We have three panelists, and we have also an anchor, and I will introduce all of them in turn. But before I do that, I want to just spend a few minutes laying a context for what we're going to talk about today. I'll also share a little bit about the seminar series that we are in fact hosting jointly with the Omidyar Network India. So the topic for today's webinar is a three-way urban labs conversation focused on spatial practices and critical mapping. We have representatives from the Beirut Urban Lab, the Karachi Urban Lab, and Hyderabad Urban Lab participating in this conversation. And they will be speaking largely from their experiences in using spatial practices and critical mapping to make the city's land and other resources more accessible and inclusive. The discussion will also center around modes and pedagogies of working, the explorations, connections, and the different kinds of collaborations that the lab as a site enables in the city context. To say a little bit about this series, this is the fourth webinar we have held in this series, which is a collaborative effort between the Center for Urban Policy and Governance at the School of Habitat Studies, TIS, Mumbai, and the Omidyar Network, India. The purpose of the series is to create interdisciplinary dialogue amongst academic scholars and practitioners, activists and policymakers, and all sorts who are interested in these issues. There's a broad focus on looking at contemporary developments related to and ongoing experiments in making land and housing more accessible, more inclusive, and addressing a series of different themes related to land rights for marginalized urban groups, issues and challenges of today, such as dealing with real estateization, the commodification of the commons, formal land markets, as well as informal land markets in the global south, and theorizing land and social relations around land. The speakers for today's conversation, Urban Labs conversation, let me introduce and begin, in fact, with our wonderful anchor, Dr. Anant Maringanti. Is the executive director of Hyderabad Urban Lab. He's a geographer with a PhD from University of Minnesota. His research and teaching interests center on questions of urbanization and globalization from the South Asian vantage point. And in fact, he is very much involved in experimentation through the Hyderabad Urban Lab today. But today he'll also be functioning as our anchor, anchoring this three-way conversation. Our three speakers, representatives from three different urban labs, are Bhashwati Sengupta, who's a representative from the Hyderabad Urban Lab. Bhashwati is concerned both in the personal and work spheres with enabling processes of learning, primarily among those that have little or no access. She's interested in initiating sustainable practices and inclusive interactions within local communities and creating occasions that bring people together regardless of their primary identities based on class, caste, age, gender, or whatever. Our second representative is Mona Fawaz. Professor Mona Fawaz is in fact, a professor in urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut. She's also a co-founder of the Beirut Urban Lab at the American University of Beirut. She'll tell us more about the lab, so I won't spend more time on that. But Mona's research spans urban history and historiography, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, land, housing, property, and space, as well as planning practice, theory, and pedagogy. Mona has also been deeply involved in Beirut's ongoing transformations and has done a range of different publishing and working in different kinds of networks and experiments that she'll be talking about. Our third speaker and representative from the Karachi Urban Lab is Nausheen Anwar. Nausheen is director of the Karachi Urban Lab, and she's also a professor of city and regional planning in the School of Economics and Social Sciences, the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. Nausheen received her PhD from the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, and her work focuses on the politics of urban planning, climate change, and infrastructural development in the global south. So that's a very, very impressive lineup today. Really delighted to welcome all of you. And I hope this is only the first of a series of not just conversations, but other sorts of collaborations and exchanges that we can have across urban labs in the global south. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Anant Maringanti as our anchor to take the mic and take control of this session.
Take control, that's a bit of a scary thing. But I'm really happy to see so many friends here. It's a great experience, and as many of my friends know, I never hold back when it comes to a chance to talk about what is lab about a lab. The truth is that when we set up our Hyderabad Urban Lab here, we had a guest who's a neighbor who came in and said, so you are setting up a herbal lab, because they seriously believed that we were going to set up a beauty products lab. And so for us, it was always an interesting experience trying to distinguish ourselves from herbal labs where we produce beauty products. But so I'm going to quickly lay out the structure of how we are going to do this. I, with the permission of all the other speakers, have pushed for saying that we're not going to try and build one big picture, because one big picture that everybody agrees on is not quite a viable thing in a situation like this, because each city has a very different kind of extremely intense experience. And that's the whole point of an urban lab, right? And to me, one of the ways in which I've always thought about an urban lab, many ways, is that it's about your very intense affective relationship with the city. And it's the fact that you love it, it's the fact that you hate it, it's the fact that it draws a very visceral reaction from you every time you look at it. That's what becomes your method, and that's what becomes your sort of organizational and working principle. So that's what we're going to be looking at. I'm going to be, so this is how we're going to structure it. We will have 3 to 4, 5 minutes of visual presentations from each of the cities. First, just to give a sense of what is the kind of city that we're looking at. And after that, I'm going to pose a set of 4 or 5 questions to each of the speakers. And then we will have one question that each speaker is allowed to ask the other speakers. And then we will have the next round of conversations, mainly with the audience. So that's basically the structure. So Ratula, do you have any order in which we are going to do this? You have Nausheen's presentation, right? You want to start with that?
Yes, if Nausheen's okay with it. Nausheen, sorry, you're on mute.
Unmute.
To unmute yourself.
Yes, I am. Can I share my slide now?
Sure.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I understand the question of time. So I intend to take maximum 5 minutes on this. So if I could just begin by saying really what a privilege it is to be invited by the Center for Urban Policy and Governance at TIS to be a part of this excellent forum and to be in conversation with people whose work I have long admired, and whose work at the labs, and the idea of the lab is in a sense also an inspiration for my colleagues and me as we set up the Karachi Urban Lab about 4 years ago. And I'll explain a little also as to, hopefully later on, and some of the questions that Anand will pose as to why the lab idea is something that really fits our objectives over here in Karachi, my colleagues and I. So very quickly, the Karachi Urban Lab was set up approximately 4 years ago. And it came together as a sort of a collaborative endeavor between a group of us who are urban planners, architects, anthropologists, and artists. And we were already working on a couple of different projects, and we suddenly realized that, the things that we're doing, the kind of space that we've already created for ourselves, there's really nothing like this in Karachi. It's kind of a different sort of space. It's it's not the usual think tank space, which are for research, which is quite common in Pakistan. And here we are working inside a public sector university that actually happens to be a very neoliberal business university and quite sort of brand oriented. And then we have the social sciences department, which is quite a new endeavor. So let's sort of set up something inside this and make it quite loose and open-ended. And that's kind of how it started. And so initially, when we were working together, we were working extensively on issues of land displacement and evictions and issues about rights to the city through an intersectional lens. And then gradually, as we've taken on new projects and in terms of our own observations and our engagements, some of the more pressing issues that have come before us are those of climate change and related issues of infrastructure and vulnerabilities, and different scales and layers of urban violence, direct, indirect, visible, not visible. So the whole land dynamic, the issue of real estate, land transformations, conversions, for us now has coalesced with these equally important and challenging questions of climate change and infrastructure vulnerabilities. A lot of our work is interdisciplinary, and the interdisciplinary issue has become more important as we now find ourselves in situations where we're working alongside or with engineers and epidemiologists looking at issues of global warming and heat and so forth. And within this we're pushing ourselves to try and become more innovative with methodologies and not necessarily a straightforward process, and the whole issue of how do we challenge ourselves as we try to learn across cities. So this is just a quick snapshot of some of our colleagues, two of whom actually in as part of the audience today. I did a quick scan. My colleague Soha Maktoum and my colleague Adam Abdullah, who really are some of my sort of very, very close comrades in leading the KUL forward, along with several other associates. So some of whom remain with KUL, and others who are now pursuing their PhDs and master's degrees in urban planning and city and regional planning across the world. Something that really heartens me, because especially the young women who've worked with the KUL and are now pursuing urban planning and geography degrees. So at any given point in time, depending upon the kinds of things that we are doing in Karachi, which is a big city, unofficial population 25 million, currently going through these sort of vast and very violent process of land displacements and evictions that have been an ongoing part of Karachi, but have become particularly intense in the last few years for a variety of reasons. You will find us sitting out there in the fields, collecting, carrying out our household surveys and conducting in-depth interviews right amidst some of the communities that we've forged alliances with, who've been at the forefront of being impacted by the land displacements. Or you will find us sitting inside the KUL offices, in the IBA offices, liaising with civil society organizations like Caritas, Faizan, Global Trust, Al-Khidmat, some of the Islamic welfare, as well as Catholic non-governmental organizations that have become very active in the disaster risk reduction, disaster risk mitigation landscape, issues that also tie up with much broader dynamics of degraded ecologies, transforming ecologies, and so forth. So we straddle sort of in our desire to remain connected with public policy dialogue. We do try and associate as much as possible with a wide a diversity of stakeholders by either bringing them into forums and conducting workshops, or sort of being closely aligned with some of the communities that we work with. And of course, because this forum is in a large part about critical mapping, spatial practices, etc., a very important part of our work, of our methods and our outputs is mapping the kinds of things, the kinds of issues that we see before us, the most important of which over the last couple of years has been the land displacement, anti-encroachment drives, and we really sort of thrust ourselves into finding ways to map these dynamics and to make the maps as available as possible, either on social media or through different kinds of forums. And some of these maps that I'm sharing before you that are the wonderful work of my colleague Adam Abdullah, are really about tracking the journeys of people in different temporal moments and trying to understand and actually sort of see on a map what these journeys look like and the temporal contexts of these journeys, because it meant a great deal to us, what these stories represented and what these stories were telling us. And then in a sense also trying to visualize the spatial scatter, of these land displacements across the city and beyond. So I will stop right there and hope to talk a lot more about the mapping part of this as we go along in this conversation. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nashin. That's very lovely. You have already a lot of things on our plate to talk about. Mona, do you want to go next?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for the Center for Urban Policy and Governance for hosting this, for the invitation. I'm really happy today. This is truly one of the aspirations of the Beirut Urban Lab, to be able to be in a conversation with colleagues in other contexts of the Global South, thinking together about issues of space and urban change and the possibility of working towards more inclusive cities, more viable cities. So it's really great to see this conversation initiated, and we really look forward to having more of this. I'm also going to share a screen and try to keep time. As you'll see, there's a lot of parallels with what's already been presented in the sense of the idea of faculty members who had been working in different contexts over the past decade on issues of, this is crashing, I'm sorry. Anyway, I'll talk and it will reopen, on issues of post-disaster recovery, on issues of urban change and transformations and factors that affect public space and its practice in the city. And that we were hoping to be able first to create a conversation around. And so convergences between us led us eventually to the idea of forming together a lab. Today, the lab has about 20 researchers. That includes the 4 co-founders. We are political scientist, a graphic designer, an urban historian / urban designer, and a city planner. And the 4 of us have been really committed to working towards these conversations, these interdisciplinary collective projects that link documenting the city with thinking about the city and generating debates around issues that are happening there to actual urban projects. Some of the work we produce is really in Arabic, in the local language, reflecting on things that we feel are affecting profoundly the practice of the urban. So what you're seeing, for example, here is one of the early mapping that we had done, in which we mapped the security mechanisms that control Beirut's city. They include both Beirut's streets and public spaces. They include both public and private security mechanisms. And I'm showing them deliberately because, as you know, this week, Beirut made again the cover of the international news on street fights. And so being able to understand the extent to which these fights are around hotspots, how they transform people's practices and segregate the city is really important. And it's an ongoing mapping and transformation in the city. Not all our research is about...
Hello, sorry.
Yes?
Mona, I think your presentation isn't running. Can you just,
oh, it's not showing. I'm sorry, yeah. I'm talking on my own. Okay, thank you so much for... Thank you so much for telling me. Are you guys able to see it now?
We can see it. If you can just go to the slideshow mode. Yes, that
works.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I'm sorry. So here you see the map I was referring to about the security mechanisms and the different products that were produced in the different articles that were written around that issue. I'll skip right away to a second body of work we've been doing, in which we've been trying to understand how different disenfranchised groups in the city practice its publics and contribute to its making. And as you know, in the last a decade, actually over the course of just 2 years, Beirut hosted more than Lebanon hosted over 1 million refugees. So that was a 25% increase of the population over 3-4 years. And the outcome was a lot of difficulty and imagination of how to think through this new population. And one of the things we really wanted to emphasize was the extent to which refugees who arrive in the city actually build connections and learn the urban. And that project that I'm showing here, which is one of several interventions, map the practices of delivery drivers who are refugees, trying to understand how they learn the city to be able to work as food delivery drivers, what landmarks they draw, but then again, how these landmarks and the connections recreate in the practices through which they move around the city, dividing lines that exist in Beirut since before the war, how they connect certain things and how they allow us to re-see the city as a different geography. More recently, we've been working at the scale of Lebanon, and I'm really just showing you different projects to give you a flavor of what kind of research is being produced. Of course, this is all work with colleagues. A lot of it, I'm not leading this in this context, is about COVID. And the idea here was that when the COVID pandemic struck in Lebanon, we saw all the political parties in the country trying to re-territorialize the country into different enclaves and providing aid and support using this notion that COVID brings, that you shouldn't cross and you should stay in your own area and the famous 15-minute city, to actually recreate dividing lines that are exactly those of the Lebanese Civil War. And so we mapped here the different kinds of aids that are produced, and you can see every political party in an enclave. So what do we do with these publications? We write op-eds about them in local newspapers. We hold public debates. We hold events in different venues in which we discuss the findings. We try to publicize them in local, very simple language so that they're accessible and help contribute to the conversation. Now, our flagship project has really been an effort to create a base of information about the city. Beirut didn't have a real base map. People didn't agree on the boundaries between property lots, streets, buildings. So we produced a very detailed and accurate map of the city that we made available to everyone. And we began to map on it building activities, developers, housing loans, and to develop a better understanding of how financialization, particularly the financialization of housing, is influencing the city, but also all the connections between the banking sector, the housing sector, or the development sector, and then the political class. And
please mute yourselves, audience. Request to mute yourselves. Thank you.
And so that work then allows you to share information. And it became critical when the Beirut port blast happened, because then we could have one shared map in which multiple actors who were intervening on the post-disaster recovery could actually map on the same platform and share information about where they are helping and how they are doing. And this allowed us, on the one hand, to be able to locate the blast and its effects on what was already happening in the city, which we felt was really important in order to avoid a post-disaster recovery that reproduces the same inequalities and patterns that we were seeing before the blast. And on the other, to set up the base for an urban observatory, which is now available online and growing, which maps who's coming back, who's intervening where. We're organizing this work in a context where the public sector is really absent. The municipality plays almost no role in the post-disaster recovery. It's fully delegated to international organizations and to local NGOs. And so we find that role of pushing for interventions on the public spaces and not only the houses, and being able to contribute to coordinating that work critical. This, of course, doesn't only happen through mapping, it also happens in public deliberative sessions in which we discuss issues of post-disaster recovery and how to fix a garden, as you can see up, but also thinking more largely about urban issues and urban transformation and our place in them. And sometimes these lead to projects such as this one, which is an alternative master plan for the city's coast that sort of attempts to provide a vision for how it should be. Today, we're also working on similar projects. We don't think of these projects as projects that the city authorities will take and implement. We think of them as documents that bring together the urbanists of Beirut first around a similar issue that becomes a common sense around planning that is direly needed, but also and especially a demand that city dwellers can have about an imagined urban. There's much more I don't have time to give credit to, and I'm looking forward to giving more detail as we move further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona and Nosheen. Both of you could have spoken from Hyderabad Urban Lab. the kind of things that I'm hearing are so close to our heart. I'm going to very quickly show you a few maps and tell you a couple of stories before we move on to speaking without the maps. Ratullah, can you just turn on my presentation? I had to request Ratullah to do this because my internet is sometimes very iffy.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to lose it in the middle.
Visible?
Not yet.
Okay, just a minute. Yes?
Yes. Can you move to the first slide?
Sure.
So you're looking at what is called the municipal area, the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation, and you're actually looking at the electoral map of the city. I thought this is an important map to see because everything in the city can change one way or the other, but the green segment, which is towards the south, has remained pretty much the same for a very long time. That is considered to be the area where the Muslim voters are concentrated. The Majlis-e-Ittihad al-Muslimin is located there. The rest of the city's political colors can change, but this one doesn't change. And it has a lot of consequences for the way in which the city works, right? It's a structural feature that there is a powerful identity that holds the grassroots level, street level political space in the city. Yeah, next one. So this is a map that I really, really love. We did it fairly early on in the beginning of our work in Hyderabad, at a time when we really did not even know the lat-longs of any of the bus stops. So we had a researcher who was very enthusiastic, sat down, put a large piece of paper on the ground with a printout of the map and started putting dots on it. And so literally built up the map of all the bus stops in the city, and then work with data on the ticketing of these buses, right? So once you know the bus stops, and once you know the bus routes, and once you know how many tickets are sold on each of these routes, then you work with that data to produce what are the corridors. The reason why I love this map is that this shows how very dramatically the city has changed in the last 20 years. This diagonal line that you're seeing from the northwest to the southeast in dark blue did not exist 20 years ago. The city used to run primarily north to south and south to north. But what has happened in the last 20 years is that on the west side of the city, a lot of premium real estate has developed, which is globally connected. And that is the structure of the city, right? You have a 400-year-old city, which is south of the river. And then you have a city that developed primarily in the 20th century towards the north. But towards the west is where you see all of the high-tech development that is connected to Riverside, California, connected to London, New York, Chicago, all of that, which is where all of the data processing jobs and sometimes slightly higher end IT jobs are all located. It needs high connectivity, it needs very, very special kind of real estate, which is very exclusionary, but it cannot really hold off anybody because the moment you have some development, there are people concentrating around it all the time anyway. The second part of this is the brown pieces that you're seeing. All of those dots are essentially the slums of the city. And there are about 1,400 which are technically government recognized slums in the city. And there are maybe another 600 which are not. Now, these are all the places which can teach us a lot about how a city like Hyderabad squeezes land out, at least one of the processes. All of them are located in lands that have kind of uncertain tenability, uncertain ownership. It could be old ecological commons, which are the water bodies, which have been reclaimed because the water body has itself died. It's all of those different kinds of pieces of land which have been reclaimed and turned into slums. So what we were trying to do in this map was to see how they're all interconnected, where are the gaps, where are the white spots, where are there no transportations in the city, and what can we make of this map. Ratullah, can you just move to the next one? Okay. This is one of the examples of the slums that I was talking about, where land has been squeezed out of nowhere, right? You see a water body here on the western side of this piece. And north of that, that big red patch is basically a hill slope. And on that hill slope, you have very, very densely populated slums, which have emerged in the last 20 years, because north of those slums area now is a very high-end development. Very, very premium real estate is there right at the top of it. And therefore, you have all of this land, which is the old commons, which has been occupied. And the tank, which is on the west side, is completely turned into a cesspool because the sewage of all of this area has nowhere to go and it goes into that. Next one. Excellent. Yeah. No, before this. The one before this.
Yeah, just a minute. Yeah.
Okay, here you get a sense of what these places look like, right? The hill slope that I was talking about is what you see here, actually on the west side, which is the slope of the hill, on which you have all of the slums. And then below that is this water body. And then right next to that is your high-rise apartments. So you have, at the foot of the hills, you have the high-rise buildings. On top of the hills, you have the high-rise buildings. On the slopes, you have the slums. And that's what you're seeing from the top in the image below, where you see people making all kinds of arrangements to somehow manage to access resources like water, store the water, live and convert the street space itself into commons, all of that. This is what basically happens. So to conclude, I mean, this is just to give a sense of what the city is like. Couple of things I want to highlight. One is that while it may seem like in the last 20 years, we haven't had any spectacular violence in the city, although we did have a few incidents. This kind of a landscape is full of very, very invisible violence that kills people on a day-to-day basis, which makes people very, very vulnerable in all sorts of ways. And what we've been attempting to do is at one end, work with large data sets that give you structural sense, but at the other end, look at very, very minute hyper-local places to understand the relationships in that place. So this is one big part of our work, which is trying to figure out how to map, how to represent, how to tell stories, how to create a shared language of spatial information that is going to give us the space in which we can work. But the second part of it is that we have to tell these stories to somebody. Right? And so we actually organize a number of events in the city. And the biggest one happens sometime in December, where we have a 2-day gathering of a lot of people of very different kinds who are unlikely to meet each other, brought into one location. I'm just going to show a very quick video, a minute long, where you will get a sense of what that engagement space looks like. This is the place where you will find scrap dealers coming and talking to IT professionals. You will see poets coming and speaking there to social scientists. All kinds of interactions are created. Can you turn it on? Can you make sure the audio is working?
Can you see it?
We can see it. But the audio is not there.
Just a minute.
Now it's working. Thank you, Atula. So, all right. So let's get started on the business for this evening. As I said, I'm going to do this by posing a set of common questions to everyone, just so that we get a chance to hear how people relate to the urban environments in which they're working, what they think is the relationship between the lab and the city. So my first question to all three of you, Bhashwati, Mona, and Nausheen, is if you were to name one very visceral connection that you have with the city, something that you love, something that you hate, something that draws a very intense reaction from you, what would that be?
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
Okay, great question. Thank you, Anand. So this is a question I can't answer on my own. So I had a session with Adam and with Soha yesterday, but look, Anand has sent this question, so let's talk about it because we work together. And so, what do you think? And Adam's response was, commute is hellish. So the whole idea of getting out of home and coming to work means that in a relational context, the distances, the manner in which the city has expanded and grown, the fewer choices that we have on a daily basis in terms of finding ideal locations and increasing commute times makes it very difficult to experience Karachi, in a way that is pleasant. And Soha said something along the lines, right, that whilst those who are in a position of power have destroyed the body of the city, the soul is still intact. And how do we get the soul of the city back? And so I was thinking about their comments, and in that context, my own immediate sort of thought is this constant khudai across the city. The khudai, the Urdu word, right? This constant excavation, breaking, pulling apart. Roads are broken, the debris and the rubble that lies everywhere, and then it kind of gets swallowed up by the garbage and the sanitation. And you're constantly navigating yourself. Of course, for someone like me, it's in a car, so it's very privileged. But for the everyday, for the ordinary citizen, these navigations are becoming harder and harder, almost impossible, because at every route, at every point of navigation that might have been familiar at one turn has suddenly become unfamiliar at another turn, because that bridge is gone. That road that used to lead to a secondary inner lane to a neighborhood has suddenly disappeared, and something else has come up in the way. I think that this issue of khudai, this constant excavation and breaking apart and then not putting together necessarily, right, which has been going on in Karachi for well over 2 decades now, in some mighty, ambitious plan to revamp the city, but on ground, somehow it's not stitching together, it's not coming together, is that one visceral dislike that I certainly have, right? And while Soha might find a way to recover the soul of the city in the midst of that, I'm still trying to battle my way through it and finding it very difficult.
Thank you. That was a lovely story. Mona, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'll just react by saying that this could have definitely been my reaction to Beirut pre-COVID and pre the financial crisis. We really used to suffer a lot from traffic jams, and I used to say you just have to drive to realize this is a society on the verge of nervous breakdown. You just see people like going crazy, and the city is divided. Of course, Beirut is nowhere as big as Karachi. We are barely, with our greater city, 1.3 million people. But it still remains very difficult to move. In the last year, with everything becoming so expensive, including the cost of fuel and not having public transport, you're seeing less and less actually traffic jams, people not being able to move around with private cars, and there is no public mobility to speak of. So that, beware of what you hate and what the alternative can be. I found myself particularly this week thinking about how much I hate the fact that Beirut's picture is always presented as the picture of a violent city, of strife and chaos without logic. So I hear friends who work in Europe and who would say that when they want to refer to something which is very messy and violent, they would say this is Beirut. And I hate that, because despite years of civil war and despite all the divisions, there are still in the urban spaces of encounter, places of beautiful conversations, of making public space, of inventing the practice of a public, really, that exists everywhere in the city, and that I really love. So I thought I just wanted to really share one picture, which is Beirut's seafront. And it's a place we hold dear, because it's a place that, despite all the urban divisions, remain the one place that people come to in the afternoon, whatever their religion is, wherever they live, rich and poor. There is a strong space of mixity that brings people together, and that is extremely special for the city. And it's a place that a lot of the work we do at the lab revolves around. Of course, it's nowhere a perfect place. It can be quite masculine. There could be divides and people wearing signs of exclusion, but in general, the quality of the space, the kind of encounters it allows, seems to me to remain magical. And so this is sort of the image of Beirut I wanted to share. That would be something that people don't usually associate with the city.
Thank you. Mona, that's a lovely picture. I would pull it. Bhashwati?
Yes, for those who think that I am mute and I'm going to just sit there looking at everybody, I do have a voice. And sometimes, often I ramble. I will try not to. And I was told I must not apologize for not being an academic, for not being a planner, etc., etc. But just a word of caution that whatever I say is going to be very removed from the general academic language and idiom. And also because my work is mainly with people, has been with people. So when I think of the city, it's the people of the city that I usually think about. Of course, one can connect it to spatial things as well, but I like at this slide, it's about the people, and it is about this city. So when of course, physically one loves the rocks of the Deccan, and they are just fabulous formations that have formed over millions of years. But the real estate developers and the state government, which has been told that it is not its private property, they think nothing of blasting the rocks away. So those will go very soon. The people are likely to stay. So among the things that causes me a lot of discomfort and rage is this, there's an expression that they use here, which is light lena, um, approximately translates into take it easy. And that seems to seep into everything. And the reason that it bugs me so much is that this casualness does not come from a place of equanimity. It indicates a very deep mental lethargy almost. You know, it's okay. It's okay. So everybody at all levels has this thing of it's okay, you know, there's no sense of urgency at all. And it cannot be. Of course, they try to romanticize it by saying that
You're muted. You'll have to unmute yourself. Bhashwati, you'll have to unmute yourself.
She's in the waiting room.
Hi, Bhashwati, are you here? You need to unmute yourself.
Let me check what's happening.
can you hear me?
Can everyone put themselves on mute, please? Manjula?
I don't know. I have. Can you hear me? Can people hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Oh, okay. So there's this thing that, you know, it's fine. It's fine to be casual. There's nothing wrong with it, and they romanticize it by saying it's the Nawabi culture. In fact, the hospitality industry actually sells it. They actually promote it. You know, have a late breakfast at 11:30 or at 12 on Sunday. So the reason that I get bugged by this is I find it coming into the sphere of work and relationships and everything, and it kind of dismisses the concept of quality. You know, quality just doesn't enter the scheme of things because we can take it easy. So that has bugged me for so many years. And what I really like is another facet of the same coin. There is, because people have this thing, and everybody comes into this. Those who come in, those who are not original, they are not natives, as they say here, of this place. They also adopt this kind of an attitude, thinking that it's some kind of, you know, it makes them belong, or they will not be seen as outsiders. But what is good about it is that it is accompanied by a very self-deprecating kind of humor all the time. On the streets, you will see it in organizations, institutions, schools, colleges, you know. So because there is this self-deprecating humor, which is again not coming from a place of self-reflection, but there is this thing, you know, we are like this only. So that gives a little bit of room that there is no rigidity, and people do not take themselves so seriously that they won't allow any kind of action, any kind of transformative interactions. So it's this taking light which is a plus and a minus in my mind, apart from the rocks, apart from the lots of trees and greenery and all that. So this is what affects me about this region.
Right. Thanks, Bhashwati. What Bhashwati has actually said, to my mind, is what is often said about the entire informal economy, or so-called informal economy, that it is about not caring for quality, but trying to take things easy. And without romanticizing it, there's a way in which one could possibly think about this as having to do with the historical and geographical location at which this occurs at a particular uh, in a particular manifestation. And that's something that we need to keep thinking about, because these are cities in which And I'm sure this is the same story for Karachi, same story for Beirut, same stories for a lot of cities in the global south, where the, um, the, the trajectory of modernity, the forces of modernization, have left each of us in some strange location in relationship to some kind of a universal modernity. So it's that uneasy location in relationship to some universal modernity that we have constantly struggling with, right? That's where that self-deprecation comes from. That's where that take it easy comes from. It all comes from that. And so part of the struggle is to figure out what is that strange location, strange island on which we have been thrown by processes of modernization in narrating our own stories of modernity. Okay, so one question that I want to ask all of you next is, what makes you a lab? What makes your lab a lab? I told you that we were actually asked if you were a herbal product, beauty product lab. And there's something about this idea of being a lab, right? Where does that come from? Why are you not simply a department of your university or center? There's something going on here where many of us are feeling the need inside the university, outside the university, somewhere or the other, but working with this imagination of a lab. What is it?
May I jump in first?
Yes, please.
Okay. Oh gosh, that is such a great question and got me thinking, my colleagues and I thinking along different lines. Okay, so just as a start off, right? So when my colleagues and I started 4.5 years ago, just 3 or 4 of us thinking that, okay, let's set up something that in which we can come together as a collective. It's just a small group of us, and so there is the umbrella of a university, which gives us a bit of shelter because we need this shelter in a way, because we don't want to be a non-profit entity, because that runs into all kinds of problems in the context of, there's the pragmatic aspect, right? In the current Pakistan context, the history of war and terror, and the US Treasury and its rather predatory interventions in Pakistan, slapping down on non-governmental organizations, shutting them down because of the whole terrorism financing thing. I personally wanted to remain as pragmatic as possible, keeping those things, right? So that the non-for-profit route was not a viable one. So sitting under the umbrella of a public sector university, the other thing that I felt was not viable was turn into a sort of a department-led venture, which would then perhaps tie us down in some ways to modes of thinking that are, if I may be permitted to say, that are somewhat conventional, somewhat mainstream. And at the same time also, there is always this urgent need in Pakistan to turn research centers into what are called think tanks. And then these think tanks become flourishing grounds for, for World Bank interventions and ADB interventions for what is more policy-oriented stuff. And there is a lot of this going on in Pakistan. There's nothing wrong with it. And it's flourishing, it's doing very well, it's great work. And I can think of several such organizations, but that is something that we didn't want to be. We wanted to be deliberately experimental, deliberately open-ended, and maybe in doing that, maybe being a little rebellious in a sense that, well, here we are somewhere in between. We don't want to be that, we don't want to be this. We don't want to necessarily get shackled to the conventions of a university's order, where you have a turnover, of people every year because it has to look a certain way. And nor do we want to get stuck in the think tank category. So that was certainly a very important motivation. And then not going down the not-for-profit route. And then alongside that, sort of in the course of things, the experimental idea, of a lab. And by the way, during sort of at the height of COVID, people wrote us saying that, do you have any special medication that you are making, to, for combating COVID, right? We received a plethora of such inquiries also. So, so totally relate to that. So, but in the context of a lab, also experimenting with methods, because one of the things, as Adam reminded me, in the course of our conversation yesterday, was that data is something that is so politically driven in the Pakistan context, especially vis-a-vis the urban, right? And especially in the context of Karachi, where the whole question of space has been so deeply, deeply politicized for such a long time. And I think that by no means is that unique to the Karachi context, as is already evident in our conversations with our colleagues over here. But data is so deeply politicized that getting access to data itself is a kind of an experiment, right? How do you go about getting access to data? How do you navigate yourself in this space, in terms of creating networks and making connections and foraging through and quietly like a mole digging a tunnel into certain bureaucracies, and then suddenly you come bang slap up against the Ministry of Defense, which says, well, you can't make these maps because there's a law out there that says that map making in Pakistan is illegal, and that's there's actually a law that's backed by the Ministry of Defense. So in the context of these kinds of encounters, these experiences, I think our entire sort of methodological sort of experience has also become experimental, right? That rather than just take the census as a given or take the household, the labor force survey as a given, that we're actually trying to find ways of getting data that also rests on new ways, new kinds of experiments, right? That we're sort of navigating and finding our way through, and we're not quite sure, we're not quite certain how to frame it, how to talk about this, but Adam and so on, I would think that one of these days we might write a paper about it, right? That what has it meant over the last 3.5 years to get data, to get access to data, and the sort of things we've had to do and the sort of conversations we've had to have, and the sort of very experimental modes of thinking that we've had to rely on to get access to the data. So I think that in that sense, yes, I guess we can call ourselves a lab, but I also have to say that we've very much been inspired by Hyderabad Urban Lab and Beirut Urban Lab and the work of all of you in bringing it together. So so I'm not sure if this answers the question entirely, but gives some idea of why we're calling ourselves a lab and not a think tank or a research center or part of a department.
Great, thank you, Nausheen. Mona, do you want to go next?
Sure. Nausheen always gives me so much material to start from. It's just really comforting to see how much there are actually echoes across our context. I'll start 15 years ago when I had just finished my dissertation. And to do that, I had spent 8 months in an informal settlement in Beirut that at the time was controlled by 3 different militias. One of them was the Syrian Secret Service, and then there were 2 local ones. And they didn't coordinate with each other. And I had like in my work plan that at least 1 day a week is lost being arrested on the street and explaining to guys why I was doing what I was doing. And so and I managed somehow with that to do interviews with 100 people, residents, tried as much as possible to be systematic and send that first paper for publication, only to get rejected 1 month after with the editor saying, we don't publish anecdotal data. This is not systematic. And since then, I've had so much need to just be able to explain what does doing field work in a context that doesn't look like Europe or the US means really in most contexts. Those pictures of Foucault with the archive, and they all look clean and there's all these stacks. And then when after months of visiting the mayor and doing all sorts of things, finally you're allowed into the archive of the municipality and it's stacks of building permits and you have to wear a mask because there's so much dust and a rat jumps and a cockroach comes out, and you finally get a few building permits from the 1960s and you can actually write an urban history. I think there's so much of these realities of what the state actually is, what an archive looks like, how does one interview, that requires us constantly to invent, to experiment, so we can tell a story that is faithful to what we're seeing and not to methods that are designed by people sitting behind desks millions of kilometers away and thinking they should dictate. And the more we're sort of being engulfed in this work of word of American academia, and Nosheen spoke about the constraints that we have because we have to do compliance with the US security systems, and they're huge, even who we can talk to, who we can invite to speak in our university. But then there's also, how do we do research if we want to be published and promoted in our institutions, with all the internal review boards, the ethical boards that have these like very straight guidelines of people who have definitely never walked in a city in their life. And I don't think it's just our cities. So I feel that there's so much actually about experimenting, about inventing, about designing methods that are faithful to a reality and to particular social encounters, instead of being faithful to a script that are absented from research. And that's, I think, why we wanted so much to be a lab in the way in which we thought about how do we, and of course, there were a lot of conversations with the 3 other co-founders and eventually with the group of researchers about how to frame ourselves, who we are, and why is it that we're a lab. I'll say a couple more things. So first, in the method of research and what we call research, for me, the lab points to this experimental point, which is very important. Then there's the issue of how do you enact change? How are you effective? And Nosheen started with this idea of research centers, right? Or think tanks. And the assumption that colleagues have is that you produce a work of science and you give it, and then you have a decision maker who takes it and goes and implements it. So when your decision maker is anyway not listening to science, and when your decision maker is anyway doesn't care about what is a public good and has no notion of what is a public good, the idea that you can do anything other than experiment in an ecosystem with partners who are outside the university, to imagine how you can strengthen each other to bring that change that you dream to bring, to articulate theories of change that we really don't control, but that we're trying to invent and design as we move forward, again, throws us into a world of heavy experimentation rather than script. And here too, the notion of lab became really important. I think I've outdid my time, so I'll stop here, but it's a great question.
Thank you so much. It's a question that I keep asking myself every day. Bhashwati, do you want to go?
Yes, thank you. Mona and Nosheen make my work very much easier because, you know, we are just planted in such nation states where the bureaucracy has decided they'll do things, institutional structures have decided what we require. So a lot of what you say resonates and also establishes why we needed to be a lab rather than a department or a school or a center. But in our case, it was also, Hyderabad Urban Lab is now 9 years old. So it was also our location at the outset, which put us outside of university spaces. We have a couple of central universities in the city and some older ones, older conventional universities, but it would have taken just too much effort and energy to find our way into those, even had we attempted it. We did not. There was, of course, that whole pragmatic thing that outside of the institutional spaces, how do you even survive in this moment? But we said, let's just try, we'll see. One of the things that helped us decide the mode of functioning and understanding the city was the fact that there was no money to pay, really established researchers. So we knew already, and we were kind of, we were inviting younger people, just finished graduation, just finished their masters, because at that point, the mandate was that there should be more and more people who are interested in the city, who know to read the city, who can convey what the city says to them outside of conventional forms, outside of what the books tell you, what other institutional structures tell you. So it seemed the most logical thing to do to get younger people in. And when you're doing stuff with younger people and you want them to understand, you want to stay out of rigid frames. So it was made easier, while we were quite clear that we did not want to operate within the very rigid academic and other think tank kind of policy and planning structures. It was also the fact that these young people were coming in to understand the city and were completely open. They were like sponges, okay, just tell us and we will. So Harsha goes and sits down and looks at all the maps and catches hold of a couple of university students and says, go look for the bus stops, actually get into a bus and go and look for the. So at every point we were trying to find different ways of doing it, which would enable the researchers themselves, the interns, to explore the city from all possible angles with all kinds of people. And it was what you say about Mona, what you say about the archives and rats jumping and cockroaches crawling out, and the people manning the archives not willing to share one shred of paper unless you are a foreign researcher. Always in this case, white skin manages to get some access, not all of it, but some access. Our researchers can do nothing at all inside of those spaces. So they would have to go out, they would have to talk to people. So it was only in a lab context that such a thing was possible. You could constantly, it just did not allow us what we were attempting to do, what we really aspired to do, did not sit well at all with the kind of the kind of very rigid frameworks that come with the institutional structures. So for us it was partly just organic, and partly then when we found that it was working so well, we just continued with it, and that is how it has stayed. So even within the formal research kind of thing and with engagement, we can find new ways of talking to people, find new ways of mapping, find new ways of understanding how the people who are dealing with these challenges, how they are surviving, what is going on. So that is, in that sense, we feel that it has been a lab, and that there is no other form of institution that would have worked for the kind of work that we have attempted to do and want to wish to continue to do. I hope that is kind explains or
It does.
addresses
It
the
does.
question, Anand.
Yeah,
Yes.
it does. So thank you, all of you. And well, that's such a lot of very interesting ideas. And I'm glad that we have all laid it down on the table, and we are probably all of us suddenly finding that we're all thinking about very similar things. Um, I'm just going to pick up 3 or 4 ideas that I think are very, very important. One is that there's been a way in which space has been treated as a very apolitical, inert, dead platform on which things happen. And a lot of what we've been trying to do is to figure out how to produce that space, how to challenge the regulation that spatial structures place on us, and doing that with some degree of playfulness, right? And I think that's a very important part of what we're doing. That of course then means that we are thinking about how to valorize new forms of knowledge, how to valorize new forms of producing knowledge. Right? Exactly how do you what is considered data in the absence of any data that is actually being available to you? And I think that is a really interesting challenge for us, right? What do you do when you know that there are no maps? What do you do when you know that there is no data? How do you stitch it together? And I remember, having one of our interns um, going around mapping the movement of stray dogs on the street, trying to figure out municipal politics, right? Why do dogs go to certain corners and not to the others? How do dog populations increase? This is all about municipal budgets and municipal politics. Um, or trying to figure out how flooding happens in a particular area and not in somewhere else. Putting together all of these things, making GIFs, making animation films, producing all of these different things was what it was really the lab about us. That there is a certain degree of rigor, commitment, but it is not constrained by protocols that don't make any sense in the context in which you're working. So I'm going to actually skip the question that I was going to ask all of you, which is that why is spatial or spatial practice so important to you? Because you've already addressed some of that in what you've said. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, if you think about the lab as ensembles, bundles of practices that you're constantly putting together and unbundling, right? I mean, it's like writing a paper, doing some research project involves a set of practices. You unpack it, try and experiment with putting it back together in some other form. So if we think about this as a set of practices that gain some durability over a period of time sometimes, what is that set of practices that you think is critical to your lab? For Karachi Urban Lab, for Beirut Urban Lab, for Hyderabad Urban Lab, what would you think is key set of practices that you think is what holds up the lab together?
I don't want to keep going first, so I would refer to my colleagues.
Mona, do you want to go?
So I'm not sure I understood the question well. It's what are the practices that?
So you teach, you write in the public media. You do a range of things, right? So, for example, you work with students and orient them to think about space in a particular way. What are those practices which, in your opinion, are critical or central to your work?
Okay, so I think the first thing we need to talk about is the production and dissemination of critical knowledge. And that's knowledge that's produced collectively, often in partnership with, either in partnership with citizen scientists or working directly over an extended period to map and understand and discuss and think that's based on questions that are impactful, that are locally relevant, and that respond to a conversation that is happening in the context in which we're working. I think that that's the first thing that the lab really aims to do. And then we're also, of course, always developing the methods through which this research is being produced and reflecting critically on them, whether it's critical mapping with colleagues who are more visual and based in design and graphic design, or whether it's research methods, as I just spoke, modes of knowing and thinking through contexts that we strongly believe dictate the necessity to continuously rethink one's approaches and methods. We're definitely also interested in not doing this alone, but using it as an experience to mentor, to train, to exchange knowledge with students. We are, after all, based in a university. We all teach in graduate programs of city planning or undergraduate programs for architecture, graphic design. We're within a campus that has access to, that has a lot of students studying social sciences, humanities. And so that conversation across disciplines and that work with students coming from multiple perspectives is very important. One more thing that's really important with us is nurturing networks and supporting what we think is an ecosystem of change. And I think that works on multiple scales. It works at the local context with local non-governmental organizations, with what I think of as local heroes who are embedded in the state, because despite the big corruption, there are local actors who are trying to make a change, and having these conversations and networks with them is important. But there are also networks with other research centers, with colleagues located elsewhere, to begin to create a shared language on how do we think through our context comparatively, each anchored in where we are. And finally, definitely, there's a lot of work on public intervention, informing, influencing both academic debates, but also locally, the press, in the press, on local TV, and really in a connected way. So I find myself speaking on why there was a protest and why it happened there and why did it turn into a violent action, as much as I'm going to speak also about my own research and how it connects things. In the context of the Beirut port blast, we found ourselves trying to explain to people why the blast, to predict why the blast would end up evacuating so many people from the neighborhoods permanently, and what needed to happen to anchor people in place. And so that knowledge that you build that is interconnected doesn't allow you to compartmentalize. I teach, I write an op-ed, I write an academic paper. It's really very interconnected. And I think the lab, because it grew organically from our individual practices over a long period and continues to grow depending on who are the researchers, whether they're involved at the order of engineers and architects or in the local NGO, it will change actually the directions in which we go.
That's lovely. Thank you, Mona. Bhashwati, do you want to go next?
Okay. There's one thing, even though you cancel that question, I would like to take a few minutes for that spatial thing in the context of COVID and all the relief work that we were able to do earlier. The spaces became very important in the city. And because of the way we look at spaces, which was not technical only, which was not just the data kind of thing, and because we are completely embedded, not just where HUL is located, but also we know the city, we are very familiar with the city, we were able to find out with a little bit of nudging, tugging, pushing people, asking around where the migrants were, where the people were who were going to be hungry because everything was shut down. So, and then locating those people and reaching things to them, reaching other kinds of support other than just basic relief rations and all. It told us so much about what is bringing people into the city, what throws them out, and how they manage to live here. And a large part of that, the work that we did over the last year and a half, has actually become a very concrete part of the knowledge that we have that has accrued to us about the city. It was just knowing those spaces and being able to know, okay, where do you look? Where do you look so that you find the hungry people at the earliest? So that enabled us. So I was thinking when we do the spatial thing, I would like to speak about that. So that was important in this current context. About the practices, there are of course a lot of things, like all of us have already said, how we talk to people, how we meet people, how we do constantly innovate to find out things and then to convey what we have found out. There's a lot of talking and listening that happens at HUL, and I am a large part of that. I have found it to be very significant, whether it is with interns and researchers who also are migrants of kind. Not everybody is from the city, so they come in here, and of course the people who are located here, the person who's vending fruit on the street or the woman who irons clothes, and talking and listening to them tells us a lot about life in the city, which we do not get from anywhere else. And that life in the city, by life in the city, I mean not just the challenges that they encounter, but also the very organic ways in which they are able to almost, I would say, manufacture common resources. You know, when all resources have been taken away, or they have been taken away from resources, from their work lives, from locations that were amenable to them, places that are less hostile. Even under those very dire circumstances, they are able to create ways in which they can support each other. They can survive, not just survive reasonably, and find work for each other, uh, get some income, which is not just doles from the government. So this talking and listening has enabled us to understand a lot. And because it is not invasive, when people are talking, they will just talk. You just initiate it, and then they will tell you. So we found it to be a very non-invasive kind of understanding of what is going on. The other thing, which was initially a very personal practice, but now it has become an HUL practice, I have always felt the need to see what is going on in the city. I'm not a great walker, but I would just insist that we take a cab or an auto or something and go to different locations in the city, preferably peripheral areas, and look at the transformation directly. Who are the people? What is happening? It's not every place has a multi-story apartment or a corporate office coming up. What else is happening there? Who are the people who are able to find work there? What are the modes of transport there? So then we found that from whatever we garnered during those trips, and when we started doing the Urban 101, actually Hyderabad 101 classes with different institutions here, as well as we do the Winter Institute with this, and we do some classes with Davidson College in North Carolina, we found that this taking them to the street, whether on wheels or walking, just gives them such a direct sense of what is going on in the city. And we realized that walking and moving around the city in whatever mode is comfortable, with strict instructions to keep your cameras and phones away, it was very, very useful. So we've been using that a lot. And then we found that people come up with their own ways of representing. So even if they're not map makers, they're not cartographers, but what they see comes to them in the visual form, and they make wonderfully representative maps of what they have understood of the city. So these two things, talking, listening to a lot of stories, all kinds of people are just most welcome to come into HUL and talk. And this walking and driving around in the city so that you get a sense of what change is actually happening. We talk of change, but there's also a very meta level change that is going on, and it's
Your mic is gone again.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks, Bhashwati. Nausheen, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Anand. So, so what I'm about to say absolutely 100% resonates with Mona's and Bhashwati's comments. So, so in your question that you had shared with us earlier, Anand, you had said, right, so what matters? Pedagogy, interventions, is it solidarities? So I would say all of the above, right? And how these matter also changes, right? Different temporal contexts, different temporal moments, given what's happening on ground. So in one moment, what is the sort of the intervention that's particularly important, or the methodological intervention that's particularly important is mapping, right? So so when evictions and land displacements, which have been ongoing now for the last several years in Karachi, our mapping exercises remain very important in terms of what we are doing. And in these mapping exercises, the the connectivity on ground within communities, and listening and learning and staying abreast of what is happening in people's lives, which is not an easy thing to do. And because of the violence that people suffer, and this is, people are not always eager to talk, right? Because there are more important things happening in their lives than a bunch of academics and researchers coming and sitting, alongside them and asking for details. So, but in the last few years, we've built so a fairly strong network of of relationships within different communities in this city. Although Karachi is a massive city, it's a city which has an unofficial population of 25 million. So I'm really only talking about fragments. We are working in the context of fragments, right? We're not working in the context of taking the whole city and saying, well, here we are, here's KUL, and here's what we're doing all over the city, right? We don't have the capacity to be able to do that. So we really, really rely on the context of working in terms of certain fragments through which we remain connected on ground with people, and people who become, who are interlocutors or residents in specific settlements whom we've come to know the last several years. And mapping exercises are they're collaborative, they're co-produced, and we're also learning sort of the ropes of how to do that. And secondly, of course, a very important aspect of our work in information dissemination is building relationships with media. So the media in Pakistan has a huge presence today, and both in terms of online social media as well as conventional media forums. And it's an explosive space, and it's a space that has to be leveraged. And of course, the way that it has to be leveraged also means one has to be very strategic. And it also has to be leveraged both in English and in Urdu. So one of my colleagues, Muhammad Tawheed, is particularly adept, right, in terms of working with social media and different media forums. And so a lot of the information that we produce, a lot of the work that we do is translated into Urdu, and it is disseminated through different media forums. And it's really Muhammad Tawheed's amazing, absolutely fabulous work that enables that. I mean, I wouldn't know how to do that. And Tawheed really shines very brightly in terms of, this sort of work and a lot of other work. And sort of the solidarity aspect, right? So I think the solidarity aspect is also about pedagogy, right? And how do you build solidarities, right? And there are certain kinds of pathways and methods and learnings involved in that also. So in the course of, the land displacement project that we were involved in for several years, what we saw sort of happening before us, the unanticipated, the unknowable, the plethora of different organizations, community-based, horizontal connections, vertical connections, all of that coming together. Also, I mean, I don't want to romanticize this, right? I mean, new players like the Karachi Bachao Tehreek, which is an offshoot of the leftist Awami Workers' Party, various feminist organizations coming together within this sort of terrain of resisting evictions in land. I mean, it's a very challenging, very violent landscape, right? And this is resisting a state that has its own plans, its own visions. So, but building solidarities with them in terms of sharing knowledge and know-how as we were in the field, but also sort of feeling a little sort of, anxiety ridden about our own place as academics and researchers, right? I am not an activist, I'm just an academic, right? But some of my colleagues have become activists and they do it brilliantly, and I've been learning from them, how do you do this? Show me how you do this, because I'm not good at it, right? And so, one of my students, Fiza Qureshi, who's now doing her master's degree in urban planning at Hong Kong University, she joined our project on land displacement, and she's just forged absolutely amazing connections at the ground level, working with KBT and various other organizations. Absolutely brilliant. And I'm just so glad that she's now pursuing a degree in city and regional planning. She's going to do amazing stuff, and I hope she comes back to KUL one day. We have a lot to learn from her. So I think that these interventions, pedagogies, solidarities keep overlapping, and they keep shifting in different temporal contexts. And in this, so we wade our way through, how do we disseminate information? I mean, one of the things that we're trying to figure out just now is really, how do we write really sharp, concise policy briefs? So it's really just not more than 2 or 3 pages, or, how do you do this? And we've never done these kinds of things before. I know it sounds very naive, but as a fledgling organization, this is new stuff to us. So yeah, these kinds of things. And at the same time, also trying to build our connections with local government, provincial government systems. So Karachi is in a very sort of peculiar state right now. So we don't really have a local government system. It's been in suspension now since 2008 or so. So making inroads with, at the ward level, at the municipal level, in the context of all these other kinds of political breakdowns and limited resource capacities as far as governments themselves are concerned, local governance systems are concerned, right? Makes for a very, very challenging terrain to make these connections. But we've been doing it. So we signed recently a memorandum of understanding with the District Commissioner South, who is very amenable to building bridges, to exchange information. And we were particularly taken up by sort of the team that he brought in, young, aspiring civil servants, many of them women. And, and we felt like, wow, this is a great opportunity to build bridges, right? And with a younger generation of civil servants, bureaucrats, whom we rarely see, in front of us. So I think there are these sort of little openings, and when we see these openings, we try and insert ourselves into those spaces as we try to sort of, again, sort of navigate and wade our way through, three different kinds of pedagogies, interventions, and building solidarities. Yeah.
Thank you, Nausheen, Mona, and Bhashwati. That was a very inspiring and really stunning range of ideas. I have two more things on my three on my agenda. And I think I will do all three of them. And I hope that Ratula will give us a little more time than 7 o'clock if you really need to stay on. So I have one question for each of you. And I'm going to ask that question. It's a very simple question. So please don't take a lot of time to respond to it, but a very quick response. Mona, the question that I have for you is that I hear you when you say that people talk about Beirut as only about violence, right? But Beirut is also about violence in a way in which other places are not. So, what is your relationship to this violence? I mean, how do you make sense of it, and how do you live with it at the lab? Right? I'm hearing you say that part of what I do is to interpret and explain why violence happens or what happens. But what else is it? I have my question for Nausheen and Bhashwati. I'll just quickly tell the question so that you'll have time to think about it. Nausheen, I have always thought that, and I could be completely wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong. My sense of Karachi city is that it's a city in which ethnic identities with aspirations towards national identities are very strongly present, that they're all over the place. You can literally see them in neighborhoods. What does that mean to you as a lab? A city in which identities which are not simple enough to be neighborhood level practices, but come from somewhere else and hope to go somewhere else. And Bhashwati, my question to you is that, we have done a lot of work on migrant workers. We have thought about migrant worker related policies and so on and so forth. But for you, thinking about the migrant, the stranger in the city, emplaced in a particular neighborhood, in a particular location, has been a very important thing, right? There's a certain way in which a migrant worker comes into a city and doesn't go all over the place, but finds a particular location. And I think that's what a lot of what you've done in the last 1.5 years was about, to try and figure out where is this migrant actually locating, situating, embedding himself or herself in. Tell us a little bit more about what is your sense of this migrant worker in your city and your relationship, therefore, the lab to that migrant worker. In whichever order, whoever wants to go first, I'm perfectly fine with that. Mona, do you want to go first?
I can start since I got the first question. Let me just start by saying that for a question that I can answer really quickly, that is a very, very difficult question. So I'm gonna try to do my best to go for a couple of minutes only, because I'm seeing there's a lot of questions in the Q&A as well, and it'd be nice to engage people. I think what I reacted to when I spoke about violence in this particular case was the way in which there's a translation from understanding violent acts and representing them as senseless chaos. And very often what we see in the media is a representation of the city as senseless chaos. And so when you try to reinterpret what you're seeing as a class struggle, as a patriarchal struggle, as or even as an act of rage that comes from as a reaction to years of oppression, of being silenced, as a way of being heard, what you're actually doing is allowing for meaning to be infused into that division, and consequently for a reflection to be able to engage it. I was specifically referring to last Thursday's last Thursday's violence in Beirut, where I remember looking at the international press, and it seemed like on that day not much had happened elsewhere in the world. So Beirut was making the front line, and everywhere it said, Beirut sinks again in senseless violence. And for me, it was a very clear staged act of violence that people who are in power since the Civil War were staging exactly at the same location where the Civil War had started, showing the population that if you ask for accountability, because the violence was around a demand for accountability and allowing a judge to continue with his or not with an investigation that was going to touch members of parliament and ministers in relation to the Beirut port blast. And there was a very clear sign to the population that if you think you can ask for accountability, you're going to end with another civil war. So being able to explain that violence as a spectacle destined to the population as an act of silencing was very important. And that's only one example. Being able to deconstruct the militarized security that exists in Beirut, and then to show how it's lived very differently by people, again, allows people to think beyond a city militarized or occupied by tanks or where rifles are everywhere, to actually understand how it plays out, what nourishes it, how does it transform the practice of the public, what kind of publics are being protected, what kind of collectives are being formed to respond to it. And for that, urban space is fantastic because it allows you to understand convergences in one space. It allows you to understand how these things materialize. So yeah, I said it's going to take forever to answer the question, so I'll be careful, but I think it's really important not to fall in the trap of just saying senseless chaos, senseless violence, and to try and understand what makes it. Same thing for concepts like corruption and other ways in which third world cities often get categorized.
Thank you, Mona. That was a lovely explanation and so meaningful. Nausheen, what is the next?
Yeah, thank you, Anand. I almost feel as if the question you asked me has certain resonance with the question that you asked Mona. You know, the violence lens versus the ethnicity, the ethno-nationalism lens, right? The lenses through which, the dominant lenses through which cities are understood, because in discursive terms, there's a certain genre of literature that kind of tends to dominate, is read, is taken up, is consumed, and that becomes the primary way through which certain cities become fixed, right? So I don't deny the ethno-nationalism aspect of of Karachi and its politics, right? And we're speaking here of the MQM, Muttahida Qawmi movement, and the Urdu-speaking aspect, the Urdu-speaking population of Karachi, which locates its history in the classic sort of idiom of coming from India and the partition context and coming to Pakistan with certain visions and this notion of sacrifice and so forth. And for the longest time, yes, Karachi has been an Urdu-speaking Muhajir city, and the context of ethno-nationalism has driven a good deal of its politics. And I think here of the work of Oscar Berkayak and many others, anthropologists and political scientists who've written extensively on this. But Karachi is also a city that has transformed quite a bit, right, in the last decade and a half, 2 decades. And the ethno-nationalist prism does not help us to answer certain questions or understand the sort of dynamics of land displacement, the politics surrounding that, the attachments with the politics of water that are also in turn attached to issues of land, land appropriation, misappropriation, and so forth. And this is largely in the context of certain things that have happened in Karachi since 2013. And this is about military state-led interventions, supposedly in the guise of controlling the spread of the Taliban on the wings of the war on terror, which have in turn also decimated, for a lack of better word, a very big chunk of the MQM's power within the city. And this power has in turn, sort of the vacuums that have been created have in turn been filled by other national level parties like the Pakistan, the PTI and Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the TLP coming out of nowhere. And so it's difficult today in this present context, and certainly in terms of what we've been seeing, what we observe happening on ground, and what we saw specifically in the context of some of the neighborhoods that we worked in, where many of the evictions were taking place in 2018, 2019, and 2020, which were supposedly MQM strongholds and had been very, very important MQM vote banks for well over 2 or 3 decades in District Central, for instance. And we found that the politics had changed dramatically. You know, the MQM councillors could not be found on ground. The MNA and MPAs had changed. They now belong to different parties. And in fact, MQM representatives could hardly be seen on ground. In fact, they could hardly be, you know, found anywhere, right? In terms of reaching out and finding support for those communities that have been impacted by a great deal of state violence. So within this context, sort of the issue of ethnic identity as a prism for understanding Karachi's politics becomes very complicated, right? Because it can't be the only prism, right? Mm-hmm. So within certain Urdu-speaking communities or communities who said that, you know, we have relied for the longest time on the MQM's patronage, right? The politics of patronage. We've been part of its vote bank, and in turn, they've delivered the infrastructure. And today, in certain parts like Gharibabad, Liaqatabad, and these neighborhoods, there is no MQM to be found because after the 2018 elections, the PTI came in to fill that vacuum because of the military's sort of new cleanup operations. People could not turn to the PTI, nor could they turn to some of the other local parties because of the vacuum created and those social networks and the social capital that the MQM had left behind and that had kind of fallen apart was now being transformed and rebuilt in other ways. And one of the ways in which it was being rebuilt was not necessarily just by reliance on Urdu-speaking social capital. It was now reaching out and, to Punjabi speakers or to Pashtun speakers or to people coming in from, representing different ethnicities and different languages and so forth. Because across these different ethnicities, the issue that was the big issue was the question of land rights and housing and how people could then come together vis-a-vis different backgrounds and different political representations and different ethnicities to form a collective around these issues. Now, I'm not suggesting that these collectives are necessarily that they came together in ways that were unproblematic, not at all. There are fractures, there are definite fractures, but these fractures are also not necessarily about ethnicity. They might be about other things, right? They might be about women, they might be about gender, they might be about issues of intersectionality that we haven't quite yet figured out, right? So I find it increasingly difficult to use the ethno-nationalism / ethnic lens as the primary lens to understand what is happening in the Karachi context today, especially when we start talking about land issues and water issues and infrastructure issues and climate change impacts and so forth, right? Because the communities that are vulnerable today aren't just Urdu-speaking communities, right? And they certainly don't, in the latest census, Pakistan census shows that, we're now looking because of maybe migrations and other kinds of dynamics, we're looking at an extremely heterogeneous landscape of ethnicities and religious attachments in Karachi, right? So I think that things have transformed very quickly and very rapidly over the last 2 decades for a variety of different reasons. And the ethnic lens on its own does not help us to be able to unpack and understand these issues. I hope that answers your question.
It did. Many ways. Bhashwati, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I have no options, no? I have to speak now. Okay, I will. There are some things that have struck me, which I thought about earlier, before pre-COVID days, in the course of HUL's work, about people who come into the city from outside and make the city in various ways and make their own lives in the city through work, through education, through whatever. But in the last year and a half, I've understood a few things. One of them is, and I have a feeling that in the next decade, if mankind does survive, we will have a lot of research work, PhD thesis on migrants, and we will also, in all likelihood, have a lot of restriction, state level, government level restrictions, both at the local levels and the central government on movement of people from. We have already in India, we've already seen what is being done in order to contain that, but people will still find ways of going to other places because I realized in the last year and a half that while we have read about distress migration, and we always say it's poverty and there and lack of job opportunities and lack of growth, all that brings people into the cities, and all those are outdated notions. I feel there is of course poverty, there is a lack of job opportunities, but when a person moves from one place to another, it's almost in my mind um, like a childbirth. It comes with hope. They do not move to another place uh, with the fear of complete disintegration or dissolution. They come with hope, and which is what one saw during the entire COVID and lockdown thing. Uh, People would say, why will we go? Where will we go? We have made this place our home. Of course, they were pushed out and they had to go, but that undercurrent of hope, which now as people have come back to the city and come back to other larger cities, one gets information, is this thing that somehow or the other something significant is going to happen in the city, which will make it possible for me and my family and my neighbors and my brothers and cousins who I will bring in after me, which has been the pattern here always, that one a main part of the family or one elder comes in, or the offspring who's considered the most able is sent to the city, and then he brings in his brothers and cousins. None of that has changed in people's minds. They still feel that yes, this is significant. We have to go to the city. We will get things there. There will be things happening. There will be enabling circumstances where our lives will change, and it is not all this kind of a determined optimism, very very firm, is not coming from ignorance. It's not like they're all under some notion that they'll come into the city and somebody. There is this grit that will be able to do it. That is one thing that constantly hit me as we were doing relief work, as we were trying to reach some kind of healthcare services, and a lot of communication work, because they had to be told what is going on. Nobody was telling them. They were quite bewildered. At least last year, during the first wave, there was a lot of bewilderment, because the communication that came from the state was anything but explanatory. It was more intimidating and threatening. So organizations, civil society, and in that we collaborated with a lot of organizations who then reached out to different groups of migrants, and there was this feeling one got all the time that they are coming in here and they are quite, it is not just a detached I will go and make my life there. They connect to the city even before their journey into the city begins. That was something that came very very clearly. The other thing that we understood at HUL, because we were interacting with the migrants of different regions, and we found that they were all located not in ghettos but in special areas, almost like Indians go and park themselves in different regional. Uh, they have the Marathi center in California, they have the Telugu center. So the migrants who come into the city also have their regions. But we found a very large group of Assamese Muslim young people, able-bodied young people, a few with families, but most of them on their own. They were located in a kind of invisible, enclosed neighborhood in the heart of the western side of the city, which is all about financial district, IT sector, which is what the government showcases. This is Hyderabad. The rest of the city is a ghetto. That is Hyderabad. And these people were nestled in that small locality. All these Assamese Muslim boys who had obviously come in to Hyderabad thinking that it's a safe place, like many Muslims do. It's always not the correct notion, but people come in, and these guys had come in already struggling with the National Register of Citizens, which the Assam government had put in place, and it had caused a lot of trouble earlier. So these guys were here, and then one started to question why they were here. Why were they? How did they get to the western side of the city? How did they get these jobs as supervisors and transport coordinators and just cleaners and everything? And one realized that these guys were they're very mild mannered, and they do not know the city. So they are not likely to create any trouble in this largest region of Hyderabad, where all the foreign companies, important people, important SEZs and other business formations, they're there. And these guys, they are so scared already of what has happened in Assam, in the eastern part of the country, that they are going to be very, very quiet, and they will put up with whatever is thrown to them. And although they are there and they are on recording was given to them, because they're not on there, they do not have ration cards here. They do not have any government official identity here. So it was a very strange situation, very flashy, very good looking buildings, glass, steel, and all those very shiny names, Wiz and Fargo and Amazon and ICICI, all these places. And these guys just nestled in there without food, without job, without money, anything. And what we found was that for them, because I'm a Bengali, because I can speak their language was, they saw that as a huge relief. Ma'am, we don't need food. You have spoken to us in our language. We do not know where you are located, but it's very important that somebody here in this remote place has spoken to us in our language. So that language actually can also be something that reassures people. So these are some of the things. What are migrants and what happens in the city through them, with them, to them? One can just go on and on, like Mona's thing and Nosheen's thing. You can just, there's so much that one has understood about the city through their presence, and then the way they were rejected and the way now that they have come back. Thank you.
Excellent. So the one question that I was going to ask all three of you has also been asked by some of the audience. And that question is basically, how do you see urban labs in the global south connecting with each other and with labs in the global north? But before you answer that question, I want to say a couple of things. One, there are a number of questions in the chat box. So if Nausheen, Bhashwati, and Mona, if you want to look through it, respond to any of them in the chat box itself, that would be great. But I also want to make sure that each of you has an opportunity to ask each other a question if you want to. It's not a compulsion, but if you feel that, and I'm getting the sense that all of us were feeling that we are so alike, and we're all thinking about the same things, but maybe there are things that we're curious about each other about. So if you want to ask each other a question, please feel free to do that. Please feel free to look through the chat box and answer some of the questions. One question that is obviously is there: what are the possibilities of urban labs connecting with each other? What could be the shared practices, etc.? There are other questions which I will keep pulling out, but let's keep moving.
So I'll jump in on that, right? And of course, I'll jump in very quickly because I want to voice the aspirations of my wonderful colleague, Mohammed Tawheed, who's been following Beirut Urban Lab's work on real estate mapping. And he attended the session last year that Beirut Urban Lab had organized when they showcased their work on real estate. And of course, Tawheed, who is a GIS expert, of course said, can you send me to Beirut, please, so I can learn how the BOL did this wonderful mapping? And I've been saying to Tawheed, yes, you will go one day when we have an opportunity to connect with BOL. And so here we are with this connection. But of course, understanding completely that these are not necessarily good times right now. And for a vast variety of reasons, COVID, international travel, and all of that. But Tawheed would love to connect with BOL and maybe visit Beirut one day, and we will fund his trip and his accommodation. So you can perhaps help him learn a little bit about those mapping techniques.
Let me just say that my WhatsApp on my phone is full of messages about I love Dr. Anwan and Nushin is amazing from on the lab's internal discussion. So I definitely think an invitation and a public talk are due in Beirut. We would love to hear more about what is happening in Pakistan and to think about the parallels across our context. So definitely, this is one thing to happen. So yes, strong yes, and with great pleasure. And I'm sure we'll have a lot to learn also from your end. So that would be great. I also just want to add one thing about this, the issue of labs working together. I think it's important that we think of it as going beyond what we think of as the South being just in our context. I think that conversation about how cities work across continents really needs to transcend our geographies. I really find that it's often the case that you're either working from your contacts in Karachi or in Beirut or in Cairo or in Delhi, or you're working in London or New York about the whole world. And one of the things that we want to reclaim is the possibility to speak together from a place, thinking comparatively about our contexts and thinking together about them. And I know that this is very productive from the few instances where we had the opportunity to talk to colleagues who are also based in Chicago or in Boston, to actually, or in Austin, Texas, to actually realize that there's a lot also that they can learn from our contexts. And it's from that perspective that I think that, yes, it's great to begin to think about ways in which learning can be co-thinking, using cases from a perspective of deep learning and being able to think about them comparatively. So definitely very open to thinking further about what that would mean about research methods, about vocabulary of the words that you want to use. We often use the same words to mean very different things, but also approaches and circumstances that I think are important to put in parallel. I'll stop here because it's already 5:30, so.
I'm sorry about that. Bhashwati's connection dropped for a moment, so I had to go help her set that up. So
she's back, Anand.
Okay, perfect. So what did Bhashwati miss and what have I missed in the conversation? Bhashwati, do you want to respond to that question?
No, I didn't get to hear any part.
No, the question that I asked you, or I asked everyone, is do you have a question for the other labs?
Yeah, I have a slightly morbid question. How does one find this, this overwhelming sense of futility that overtakes one at every stage? I mean, we are doing good work, we connect with people, We are trying to, we are trying to do something, remain valid, remain relevant, but the conditions at large and also closer home in the local economies and environments, like Noshin was saying, that to expect people to respond to what one is attempting to do, even that is sometimes so uphill. And then there's this, I have a very serious problem at nights. I just sit up thinking, you know, uh, I'm expending human energy for that. For what? Why don't I just go out, cook some food, take it and give it to people? And then I tell myself, no, this will be required. This will be, everything is going to be erased. So what you are doing right now is going to be important, because it will convey things to people which are going to be significant. It's a vague kind of abstract notion. So my question to everybody is, how does one counter this? It is bound to come up in the conditions that we are existing in. That futility is, what is the relevance really? What am I even doing? So do you people have any like generic medicine for this, which we can also procure and use?
So Bhashwati, that is so, I mean, that really does strike a chord, right? And okay, so I mean, in the greater scheme of things, KUL is so teeny tiny. We are just a little patch, on the broader terrain of the city's body, like teensy weensy little whatever, and more broadly the nation and this wider region. And I will revert to saying in Urdu, Hindi, aaj hai, kal nahi hai, right? We're here today, gone tomorrow. Who knows, right? I personally I try to keep a very spiritual angle in this, because, that's kind of keeping the broader sort of picture in perspective. But there are moments of sheer joy, and that joy is part of these daily conversations with my colleagues who are like-minded. And I am thankful each and every day for this space that makes these conversations possible in this morbid landscape, right? And I am also very thankful for those moments in which I see some of my students leveraging the platform that we've created and just throwing themselves into the world out there, pursuing new things, and knowing in that moment that, okay, they used it as a platform to leverage a future for themselves. Whether it's in geography, urban planning, or these disciplines, right? Or taken it in whichever form or shape they wanted. And these are the two things from which I derive some joy, right? And some level of pleasure and happiness. And that's what keeps me hanging in there. And that's it really. I don't have a recipe.
I definitely had prepared a question that said, what gives you hope and makes you feel meaningful? So you asked it, Bhashwati, and I think it's a very important question for us. I think first, if I've learned something, for me, it's being really modest about who I am and what I can do and what I can change, because ultimately, there are so many layers of difficulty, many of which are outside of our reach. On the other hand, there's something about the urban that really gives me a lot of hope. It's the sense that a lot of the politics that we've been organizing and seeing in the last 2 decades are oppositional politics. People are against things, and it's very easy to be against things. What is much more difficult is to give people a platform where they actually can stand together and think of themselves as we. And what I've seen in my modest experience is that when you allow people to say we in the neighborhood, we in this area, we who live in this quarter, you allow for a kind of politics in which there is more solidarity, but there's also a new sense of collective. And planning rests on this idea of the collective, and the possibility of change rests on this. So reconciling people with this kind of politics is extremely meaningful. And that for me is where the work of urban labs that use the language of the city and put research and develop research that responds to claims that already exist, but that need to be substantiated very often is important. And so I guess that's what keeps me going. But there are days where I wish I could go back to school and just be a doctor and heal people and stop pretending like I can do more, or yes, just go home and do some cookies and go down on the street or be meaningful somehow. So yes, I really relate to your question.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to now quickly read out some of the questions which are in the chat box so that we can make sure that we have responded to all of them. One question from Anita Patil Deshmukh is, the lab means a place where experiments and innovations take place and fail sometimes. So please elaborate one innovation from your lab. Anita actually followed this up with another question. How do you think climate change is going to affect the urban poor in your city? So you want to quickly respond to that? Nosheen, Mona?
Okay, so on the innovation, gosh. Oh my gosh, you know, part of me wants to say, you know, I hate innovation. It's, you know, oh, why do we have to innovate, right? So I think what we're doing is sort of pretty amazing in terms of just making this collective come together in ways that are different, and having these conversations and doing the things that we are doing. So if that question refers to a specific moment or a specific tool or a specific method, I think that perhaps, I mean, I hate to call it innovation, right? I mean, this is more like a struggle rather than an innovation, right? That this is part of the process. This is part of what we know we must do because we have a stake in the system. And in changing the system, we seek transformation. We seek it through urban planning. The city is the terrain on which we work, in which we think. So for me, innovation strikes sort of something that is romantic in the course of the kinds of struggles that we visualize every day. And, you know, and then with innovation comes that other word that I hate, which is empowerment, right? And you know, I guess at a very, very simple and humble level, just being able to make the kinds of inroads that we've made over the last few years, to get to a level where people say, okay, all right, you know, the kind of work people are doing is interesting, it's different, we'll pay attention and let's talk, right? And the data you're generating is worthwhile thinking about, it's worth leveraging, it's worth looking at, it's making us think differently, it's making us look at the city differently. And it's, you know, so it's maybe the innovation is in reimagining, right? And maybe that is the innovation. Or, you know, I struggle to think of something more substantive and more sexy or more amazing to, you know, to answer this question about innovation. Yeah.
Mona?
I actually, yeah, don't have much to add to what Nosheen pointed to. Really, I think for me, the innovation is in the possibility of opening new conversations and being able, as a lab, to create conversations that, for a change, are data-driven, that empower new interpretations. So that's where I think innovation is, and it does apply to climate and other big challenges that face us.
Bhashwati, do you want to respond to that?
No, they've said it. They've said it all, and also thanks to both of you for that that thing about small joys and that giving us the, you know, the capacity and the resilience to go on. It is so important, but one tends to overlook that. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, one question is really about, as a lab, how much influence do you have with the government? Do you have any influence?
I can say very little. definitely very little influence over public agencies. So the one avenue of change that we have is where a study we would put out or information that we put out is actually taken up by the local media. We usually try to tactically also work on topics that already have people who care about them, activists who are trying to raise the issues, so that then that material gets taken up and emphasized and activated with public agencies. But in terms of actually any of the Lebanese institutions being very interested in what we do, it's really when we decide that they should hear something, we're visiting them every week, we're pushing a point. We're doing this a lot now with the post-disaster recovery. But it comes from trying to build trust with specific individuals and positions and creating overwhelming information to the point that it becomes impossible for them to pretend that we don't exist.
Okay. There is one interesting question from Vanshika Singh, which is that, if I'm understanding it correctly, and Vanshika, if you're here, if you want to jump in, please do, but otherwise I'm just going to paraphrase what you're saying. To what extent does the national framework, the national identity, national scale, come in the way of transversal connections between cities embedded in different national frameworks? Can Karachi and Johannesburg speak to each other without South Africa and Pakistan intervening? Is that correct, Vanshika?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, why not? I mean, I think that we're at the lab, we're already having these conversations. I mean, you already know this, Anand. I mean, Hyderabad and Karachi have been having conversations without India and Pakistan intervening necessarily, right? And we've made sure of that, So we've had, at KUL, we are having conversations and learning from Nairobi on climate change and urban flooding, and similarly across other contexts. So I think that this is one way in which, and at KUL, we are really very committed to the idea of learning from other cities, right? This cross-city learning is a very important objective for us. And because there is so much to learn, in these sort of, in the way that, the way that Anand has asked this question. And yeah, absolutely. I don't see that as a problem. I think where you have like-minded people and you see that there are issues out there and challenges out there that link us in such similar ways, you're right, and we observe so many similarities on ground, and we've been talking about these issues, and climate change, certainly climate change risks and impacts that bind us, in the urban context, in so many ways, so many similarities, that and I think having these conversations has become even more urgent and more important.
Perfect.
And possible. It has become possible because we can't travel anymore. So we are finding ways of doing this. I mean, I can't imagine all of us meeting at Karachi or Beirut and being able to have this. So much more has been possible, actually, through our limitations and constraints in the last year and a half.
All right, so I'm going to now ask Lalita Kamath to come and help us wrap up this conversation. Lalita, I know that I have taken really big liberties with the initial mandate that you gave, which is that we should be speaking about how can we think about labs making access to land possible for people in the city. And I think that we have talked about access to all kinds of things and what do urban labs do. And I think that in many ways, this speaks to that question, not directly, but it does definitely get at how one might imagine that work of making that access possible. How does one imagine where is the land hiding in the city? Where is it being conjured up from? Where is it being squeezed out of? all of those things are actually possible for us to think through in the lab setting. So Lalita, if you want to step in now and give us a good closure, that will be great. Thank you very much. Nausheen, Mona, Bhashwati, um, I've always been very, very careful in the last many years not to be part of any panels. So I'm really grateful to all of you for giving me a panel with all women. It's a great honor to have been on this. Lalita?
Thank you so much, Anand, and thank you so much, Nausheen, Mona, Bhashwati. This was really wonderful. I'm actually not the one doing the formal thank you. So I'm in fact going to pass on the mic to my colleague here at the center. I just took the liberty of quickly jumping in to say thank you so much. This was really, really enriching. And Anand, y'all absolutely was spot on. In fact, the topic for today was sort of large enough to look at everything alongside land and with land. So spot on. Amita, would you like to do a quick thank you from the center?
Hey, no, not me. You are the center chair, my dear. Happy to listen.
Okay, sure. Let me then just say a very quick thank you again. And we are very, very interested, in fact, in continuing these conversations, taking this forward. So we will certainly be in touch with all you folks. And we are regularly in touch with Anand anyway, but we'll continue those conversations and hope that we will be able to take some of this forward in many different ways. So thank you again for engaging with all of us today. It was really stimulating. We've got like a ton of different feedback already from folks, and it'll surely keep coming in over the next few days. This will be, in fact, up on our website as well. So for those who missed the event and who couldn't be present, you can actually listen to the recording, and that will be made available. Ratula, is there anything that you want to add here as a thank you? Maybe you can step in and just thank Nikhil and all the others who have helped us put this together.
Yes, yes. So Nikhil is the one behind the camera sort of action, putting this together. So it's wonderful to have someone to be able to, just send out invites, everything, set up Zoom. And I think COVID has certainly sort of compressed distances. Again, I couldn't have imagined doing this either in Beirut, Karachi, or even in Bombay or Hyderabad. But certainly, I'm glad that this conversation has begun. And I hope that we can see this conversation sort of take new shapes over the years. We have one-on-one, but this three-way conversation was certainly interesting with us. The fourth sort of people in the background sort of learning from you, but certainly wanting to take this forward in ways possible. So thank you for joining us, the audience as well. And of course to Omidyar for helping us arrange such a wide range of talks. They've been wonderful sponsors because they've not demanded much from us in terms of the topics that we could choose and the kind of institutions we could involve. So grateful for that space as well. So thank you, everyone.